Let's talk about OxygenOS. If you're one of the former fans out there who thinks OnePlus has lost its way, chances are the state of its software is what soured you on the brand. OxygenOS started out as a clean, minimalist, near-stock version of Android. More recently though, it's become just another variant of ColorOS, the skin made by OnePlus parent brand Oppo. So will the new OxygenOS 13 change that? Well, until recently, chances looked pretty good. The company made a lot of noise earlier this year about the UI being developed in partnership with Google and OnePlus fans. Sounds a lot like the good old days, right? But as is often the case with OnePlus and software, things aren't quite as clear as they first seem. So let's take a look at how OxygenOS started out, the changes and trials over the years, and where we currently are with the new OxygenOS 13, which I've been using on the OnePlus 10 Pro for the past week or so. I'm Alex Dobie, this is XDA TV, be sure to subscribe if you want to see more software deep dives like this, and we'll get started. As much as OxygenOS and OnePlus go hand in hand, the very first OnePlus phones actually ran software from elsewhere. The OnePlus One in 2014 launched running CyanogenMod, the fan-favourite custom ROM of the time. Since its beginnings on the earliest Android phone, Cyanogen had always been about speed and customizability and adding the features that the community wanted on top of stock Android. As a tiny team within BBK Electronics, it made sense for OnePlus to outsource the software side of things to this experienced team that already had a significant cult following. And the fact that the OnePlus One ran CM really established the priorities for OnePlus once it started making its own software. After Cyanogen's CEO blew up its relationship with OnePlus in late 2014, the company had to act fast to build its own variant of Android. And what ultimately emerged in the OnePlus 2 in 2015 was OxygenOS, built around those same core tenets that had made the OnePlus One such a critical success. OxygenOS was close to stock Android and respectful of Google's design language. It was fast and smooth while adding features that enthusiasts cared about, like custom icon packs and theming options. OxygenOS continued in this vein through until pretty recently. It grew alongside each new version of Android, differentiating itself with new features, but never straying too far from that stock look and feel. Through the end of the 2010s, OnePlus seemed genuinely proud of what it achieved with its software. Each OnePlus launch presentation inevitably included a few slides on OxygenOS and its high user satisfaction level compared to much bigger rivals. As Samsung and LG were pushing increasingly bloated software that significantly changed the look and feel of Android, OxygenOS was, as the name suggested, a breath of fresh air. However, as OnePlus grew from launching one phone a year to a lineup that included various Pro and T models and then OnePlus Nord, it eventually decided that its software needed to be more visually distinct. And ultimately this meant a move away from the stock Android look, starting with OxygenOS 11 in 2020. There was more of a focus on the OnePlus brand colours, red, white and black, and big bold typography in its stock apps. This was kinda controversial for the core phone nerd audience, but then OnePlus was becoming much less of a niche brand. In terms of the money and the numbers, that old school enthusiast fanbase was just less significant. It seemed more important to build OnePlus as a strong and visually distinct brand, including the look and feel of that software. But OxygenOS 11 was just the first of several hard pivots around OnePlus software that were met with a mixed reception from fans. The backdrop of this was OnePlus integrating much more closely into its parent brand, Oppo. Up until then, whenever journos asked about the relationship between the two, it had always kind of been hand-waved away as just sharing the same investors. But in 2020, the OnePlus cat was very much out of its Oppo bag. Towards the end of that year, the two merged their R&D resources, then in 2021, OnePlus was fully gobbled up as a sub-brand of the Oppo mothership. What did any of that have to do with software? Well, it meant OxygenOS would be based on the codebase of Oppo's ColorOS, a drastic visual departure. In theory, this would give OnePlus the benefit of the engineering work that Oppo was already doing, and that it helped OnePlus push out updates more quickly and with fewer bugs, areas that it had been struggling with as it scaled up and launched more phones. The transition would mean moving further away from stock Android, but then that was the direction of travel already for OnePlus's software. OxygenOS 11.3 on the OnePlus Nord 2 was the first version to be based on that ColorOS code and was pretty well received. It was fast and stable and looked basically like OxygenOS 11 on any other phone. But version 12.0, which arrived in late 2021, was a real mess at launch, so buggy that the official rollout had to be paused while OnePlus fixed critical issues in the software. So much for that merger helping out with software stability. OxygenOS 12 rolled out more slowly and in a less stable state than pretty much any previous version. The irony was that on the Oppo side, none of the bugs that OnePlus users had been experiencing were really a thing. ColorOS 12 launched towards the end of 2021 to a largely positive reception, so ColorOS itself apparently wasn't the problem. As rough as the software itself was, the messaging around OxygenOS 12 really didn't help matters either. OnePlus invited a host of international journalists to a virtual press conference in September 2021 to talk about, among other things, the future of its software. That didn't pertain to OxygenOS 12, but what would come afterwards. The plan, we were told, was for OnePlus phones to run straight up ColorOS in China, and elsewhere a new unified OS would replace ColorOS and OxygenOS on both Oppo and OnePlus phones, starting in 2022 with the OnePlus 10 series. Wait, what? Yeah, as you'll know if you've looked at a OnePlus 10 Pro recently, that whole unified OS thing ended up not happening, at least not in the way that was originally planned. Once again, in early 2022, there was another software pivot. OxygenOS would be sticking around for a new version, 12.1, for the global OnePlus 10 Pro, which, if you look at the code and feature set, is kinda halfway between ColorOS 11 and 12. Basically, it was missing some of the features found in ColorOS 12 on Oppo phones, because it's based on the more stable 11.3 fork that they'd been using for the Nord a few months earlier. Basically, think of it as ColorOS 11.5. The other big announcement in spring 2022 was around OxygenOS 13. With OxygenOS having been given a stay of execution, we were told there'd be a new and revitalized version coming later in 2022 with Android 13. It'd be designed in partnership with Google and OnePlus fans, while still being based on that common ColorOS codebase. That's what we have here with the current OxygenOS 13 beta, but use it for more than a few minutes and you'll see it's still very much ColorOS front and center with the few visual tweaks. For example, you've got the trademark red 1 here in the clock widget. That's not a bad thing in itself. Personally, I quite like ColorOS, but it's not exactly what most fans had been imagining for the next generation of OxygenOS. It's worth remembering that OnePlus never specifically said it'd be going back to stock Android, but yeah, with the references to Google and working with its fans, I think a lot of us took it implicitly that we'd be seeing something a lot closer to the stock look of classic OxygenOS, especially when CEO Pete Lau talked about a clean and light software experience that will be familiar to OxygenOS users. Instead, it's a software skin we're familiar with from recent OnePlus phones like the 9 and 10 series, basically the latest ColorOS with one or two visual tweaks. That's what OxygenOS is now, for better or worse. It's certainly not bad looking, but if you are hoping for stock Android, this definitely is not it. Compare the current OxygenOS 13 beta to ColorOS 13 on a Find X5 Pro, and they're basically the same, with only a tiny number of tweaks and some different font options. It's not even like OnePlus has any unique software features anymore, with tricks like Zen Mode and the widget shelf now arriving in ColorOS 13 on Oppo devices. So with that said, there are a few things here that are new from a OnePlus perspective. First up, the notification shade has been completely redesigned with some Material U influence, especially in the Wi-Fi data and media cards here. A key part of Material U, of course, is the wallpaper color picker, which is new for OnePlus phones. That was present in ColorOS 12 but missing from OnePlus phones until now. It works a bit differently to what you'd see on a Google Pixel with this manual color picker that lets you precisely choose 4 hues from your wallpaper, and these are applied to the system UI, supporting apps like Gmail and the Dialer, and OnePlus's first-party apps as well. Other features from ColorOS have now made it across to OnePlus phones internationally, like the handy floating windowed mode. Swipe all the way up and release to turn an app into a window, and from there you can minimize it into a little shortcut tab, resize it, and move it around. Animations are also improved. It's sort of hard to describe, but the way the UI elements move, especially when multitasking, just feels slicker and more responsive. It's part of the whole aquamorphic design thing, which we've covered before. It's a big part of ColorOS. That also applies to the animations in the quick settings and notification area, with fluid scrolling and a subtle bounce to them, accompanied by an improved haptic engine which is shared with ColorOS 13 on phones like the Find X5 Pro. There's a whole section called O Haptics where you can play around with the haptic tuning. Over on the home screen, you now get a collection of ColorOS style widgets for clock and weather, one of many Oppo features that now live in OxygenOS. Others include Omoji, Oppo's Memoji clone, and there's a new feature for pixelating personal information in screenshots which supports apps like Facebook, Messenger, or WhatsApp. Pretty much the only Oppo exclusive feature that you won't find in the current OnePlus 10 Pro beta is multi-device collaboration, the feature where you can connect your phone directly to a Windows PC and use multiple apps at once. We'll have to see if that will be in future builds. Otherwise, this software is 99% the same whether you're using it on a Find X5 Pro or a OnePlus 10 Pro. And that being the case, it's kind of interesting to look back at that planned unified OS for both brands' phones, which was announced in late 2021 and then backpedaled upon earlier this year. Because it kind of seems like that's what we have here, only under two different names, OxygenOS 13 and ColorOS 13. It's almost like Oppo decided that the backlash against the unified OS was more about the idea of OxygenOS going away versus the reality of the software itself, and so maybe just decided to compromise by making this unified OS anyway and calling it two different things. OnePlus phones have always come off the same production lines as their Oppo equivalents, but software was always a big important part of the brand identity that separated them. We saw this even with the derided OxygenOS 11 release, which, if nothing else, was visually distinct. Now there's no escaping the fact that OnePlus phones are Oppo phones, and that's the situation that we're going to have to deal with going forward. OnePlus may have been a critical darling and a favourite among tech enthusiasts, but the need to grow its business was always going to be at odds with the desire for its fans to continue making niche phones catering to that core fanbase. In 2022, OxygenOS is no longer vanilla Android, not even close. It's ColorOS with one or two minor tweaks. In my view, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's pretty nice, in fact, though it's far removed from the software philosophy that built the OnePlus brand back in the mid-2010s. If that's the kind of experience you want, then there are other brands like Asus, Sony, and of course Google's own Pixel line, producing phones with software closer to stock. Otherwise, we'll have a new generation of OnePlus phones arriving over the next 6 months or so, possibly including a rumoured foldable, and all of these should run software which will look more or less like any other Oppo phone. More stable, more capable, more feature-rich perhaps, but arguably less special. If you've been a OnePlus fan over the years, let us know what you think of its software design trajectory down in the comments and whether you plan on sticking with the brand in the years ahead. That's it for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.